Welcome to this episode of Rattling the Bars. Today we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Robert Chase, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at Stony Brook University. He recently published a new book called We Are Not Slaves, State Violence, Coerced Labor, and Prisoners' Rights in Post-War America. We're going to talk about his book, and I suggest that it's a book that anybody that's concerned about prisons read. Dr. Chase, Robert, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Eddie. I'm just really so glad to be on your show. It's an honor. In the beginning of my book, I dedicate it to prisoners who wanted to make spaces of criminal justice, also spaces of social justice. I know that's something that you've done your entire life and through this show, so I'm just honored and grateful to be here. Thank you.
One of the things you start your book off with is talking about revolts throughout the prison system during the 1970s. And I was involved in a couple of those revolts myself. Can you, for the audience that don't know why those revolts happened, what was their significance, and why there was such massive support from the prison populations? What was these revolts about?
Yeah. Since the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, historians have turned towards the histories of mass incarceration and racialized policing to look not just at how the carceral state was constructed, how power was employed, but how people on the ground responded and how they responded with resistance, making calls for human rights, civil rights, and calling out the prison as a space of white supremacy and power. This really begins in many ways with the civil rights revolution in the American South. After all, civil rights protesters came up with a strategy to fill the jails, understanding that jails are spaces of Jim Crow white supremacy. And during the freedom rides, protesters, of course, went to the Parchman Prison Farm. Really was no farm at all. That's a euphemism. It was a very harsh prison space. Meanwhile, of course, Malcolm X made the claim that if you were born in America, you were born in prison. And in many northern penitentiaries, and increasingly the South as well, as my book details, Muslim prisoners started to turn to the courts. And they started seeking freedom of religion and relief from the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. So there's a litigation strategy that comes out of prisoner organizing, where prisoners begin to challenge the conditions of state prisons in federal courts. This is allowed by a massive change in 1964 to the law, which previously had a hands-off doctrine of having a non-intervention of the federal court into state prisons, but beginning with the case Cooper v. Pate, which was filed by a Muslim prisoner in Illinois named Thomas X. Cooper, who wanted access to the Quran, prisoners began to file civil rights suits. And this case really did for prisoner rights what Brown v. Board of Education had done 10 years earlier for civil rights. So I think the two are connected. And in the aftermath of Cooper v. Pate, the number of prisoner rights suits increased from 218 in 1966 to over 18,000 in 1984. Simultaneously, there was prisoner organizing on the ground, particularly coming out of California and the activities of George Jackson, who was a Black Panther, and the effort to cordon him and two other prisoners into solitary confinement created the Soledad Brothers, who then went on to write Soledad Brother. So there's an intellectual transformation too. Prisoners are creating a life of the mind. If you can't escape your cell, you escape through what you read. So there's increased radicalism and identities of freedom bound up in that. Reading deeply, say, Frantz Fanon, who believed that colonized people were colonized through a mindset, and thinking about revolution over that mindset. And then after George Jackson was killed by prison authorities in August of 1971, Attica happened a month later in September of 1971, where prisoners who were not making anything more than practical claims against inhumane treatment, giving a square of toilet paper, for instance, as Heather Thompson's book, Blood in the Water, depicts, make some demands during a prison hostage crisis. And the response to this hostage crisis is that Governor Nelson Rockefeller calls in the state police, who summarily fire upon the prisoners. Over 30 people die, including correctional staff, mostly, almost entirely at the hands of correctional officers. But out of this outgrowth, that is not the end of the prisoner rights movement or claims of humanity. There continue to be civil rights suits filed, prisoner organizing on the ground, work strikes, and we see a resurgence of that today with the 2016 work strike, which was the first national prison work strike, a demand to end slavery. So my book is about the ways in which prisoners constructed a narrative claiming that they were slaves in a system that was horribly abusive, coming out of the American Southern plantation tradition during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s.
I was locked up actually in 1970. So when I went into the prison, just to share one experience with you, when I went into the Maryland penitentiary system, my first trip to the mess hall to eat, they loaded my tray up with food. Of course, it's the prisoners. They feed other prisoners. We got the food. We were corralled into sitting down in at particular areas at tables, and probably halfway through the meal, the guard came by and banged on the table with his uh, um, billy club, and made everybody get up and file out the door and dump their trays into these big buckets, which was half filled with their food. And I didn't get up. This was my first experience. I couldn't understand why they would feed us and then wouldn't let us eat. And so I just sat there and I kept eating. And of course, I was surrounded by the guards, and prisoners that worked in the mess hall came to my aid. But ultimately, I got up and I left. But it puzzled me right from the beginning. It's like, why are you treating us like animals? And of course, it was just maybe a year later that Attica that you were just talking about raised that same issue. But that issue was going on across the country. Now, one of the things that you say in your book is that the prison movement itself grew out of the liberation movement, the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement, the movements for human rights. Explain that a little bit and talk about why that didn't exist prior to then.
Well, prisoners did turn to the laws in the early 1960s, and they did so because there was a massive change in the law, that Cooper v. Pate decision that I mentioned, that allowed them to begin to take not just their own confinement but the conditions of their confinement. So if it was a question of violence, if it was a question of inadequate food, if it was a question of religious discrimination, racial segregation, and all the prisons in the South, particularly in Texas, were racially segregated, they could begin to draw up writs of habeas corpus to challenge those in court. Meanwhile, as the Black Power movement turns to Black liberation, there is a deeper critique about the ways in which the prison system itself is a reproducer of relationships of racial inequality. So, for instance, in my book, prisoners began to see that a system where other prisoners were guards, which this is derived from the slave driver system. They were trustees known as building tenders. They ran an internal economy in the prison system, which meant that the prison administration openly armed these prisoners, gave them blackjacks, knives, makeshift knives, bats, and they could run an internal prison economy by buying and selling the bodies of other prisoners as their state reward. They were so powerful within the system, and Texas employed so few prisoner guards that they relied on these other prisoners who then took advantage of the system. When the prisoner rights movement erupts in Texas, that's their focus, is to overturn this Southern convict system, trustee system. Meanwhile, in prisons like California and New York, they're also making claims that prisons operate as slavery, that it is a 20th century version of slavery as a broader metaphor of the confinement itself, rendering people of color as slaves. And of course, it's also the moment of the beginning trappings of mass incarceration, when this nation moves from about 300,000 prisoners at the beginning of World War II to over 2.2 million today. And that was rapidly expanding after the civil rights movement. And of course, mass incarceration made conditions worse, made them more overcrowded, made them more violent, accelerated everything that was bad about an institutional prison, and made those conditions worse. So the prisoners' rights movement comes right along and is part of, that's the way I think we ought to think of it, the civil rights movement, and part of the Black Power movement and the Chicano movement, making claims on identity, on empowerment, and on the general human condition that doesn't request but makes a demand for some kind of action against systematic inequality.
Okay, at the center of your book is the Texas prison system itself, which even today seems to be still the worst of all the systems. But they push forth like a modernization mythology to combat prisoners' demands for rights. Can you talk about that? Uh, their drive to change the image of their system, and how did it actually take place?
When I approach this modernization theory in my book, I think about what a historian and literary scholar of mythology wrote, that mythology is a process that can eliminate people, that is violent itself. So the mythology that the prisons constructed was a narrative that Southern prisons, and Texas in particular, were cheap, low cost, efficient, very productive, and they were a control model. That while California erupted over prisoner work strikes and then prisoner politicization stemming from George Jackson, and New York erupted in Attica, states like Texas claimed that they had a system that kept prisoners under control. It also was incredibly cheap. In 1951, for instance, the average daily cost of a prisoner in 44 states was $3.23. whereas in Texas, it was 49 cents. And this low cost feature was a steady feature of Texas prison administration through the 1970s. In the 1970s, prisoners worked 6-hour days. Prisoners were not paid for their labor. They worked on former plantations, which were now prisons. And so in my book, I call them prison plantations. They ran a plantation economy picking the cash crop of cotton. In the 1950s, Texas was known and had won the National Farmer of the Year award for their agribusiness in the cash crop of cotton. And this kept the system cheap because they also did not pay for guards. The state of Texas spent only $47 million in 1978 to hold 24,000 prisoners, whereas New York and California spent around $250 million to hold even fewer prisoners. So that's 5 times as much as what the Texas prison system spent to hold a larger prison population. So it was cheap and efficient. They didn't pay prisoners for their labor, and they had the lowest national ratio of guards to prisoner. So they made the claim that this was modernization, that the Northern rehabilitative model of psychiatry, parole, probation, and also warehousing of prisoners. I mean, clearly, prisoners of color in places like Attica didn't have access to that recreational model. I'm not saying that all prisons outside of the North had such access, but the South in particular made a claim that their rehabilitation was work, that work therapy ruled the day. And so when the prisoners struck through the prisoners' rights movement, they struck at the heart of what made the machine operate. And what made the machine operate was prison labor, prison work, and the way in which labor created and constructed an internal system that gave racial privilege and sexual assault total license within the system by making other prisoners as guards.
Okay. So now you describe your book as a social movement history of prison litigation. And one of the things that we can look at now is we can see California's 3 strikes, you're out. We can see uh, Clinton's prison reform stuff from 1995. We can see a lot of stuff outside that pushed the prison industrial complex to its size today. But you talk about the cases where prisoners actually fought back. And you start off with this one case, I think, in 1980, Ruiz versus Estelle. Can you talk a little bit about the cases where prisoners expanded their rights and fought back?
So one of the things that comes out of the Ruiz case is what I call the carceral phoenix. They dismantle, they win their case. They win their case. The judge declares the state of Texas as unconstitutional. In fact, 8 of the 11 southern states have either their main prison or their entire prison system declared as unconstitutional. So they win great gains. In the process of this, the building tender system, particularly, was declared as unconstitutional and had to be dismantled. But the ground shifted underneath the prisoners' feet in the very moment of their victory. The prison system turned almost immediately towards militarization, employing what at the time was known as the Special Operations Response Team, or SORT, today often known as CERT, Correctional Emergency Response Teams. These are SWAT units. These are SWAT units in our prisons. In Texas, they turned towards the military and hired a man by the name of Lane McCotter. Lane McCotter was a veteran of the Vietnam War. He ran military prisons, including at Fort Leavenworth, He had 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, and he was a tough, no-nonsense customer. And he created these sort units right at the moment, too, that as the building tender system collapsed, gangs came into the system. But I see gangs somewhat differently than in other treatments of gangs that see them as urban and principally people of color. I also looked at the role of white gangs, particularly the Texas Aryan Brotherhood. The Texas Aryan Brotherhood began what I call a campaign of carceral assassination, killing prisoners, particularly black prisoners, but also Chicano prisoners who engaged in civil rights protest. And so they were in a violent campaign of assassination right as these sort units and these police SWAT-like units are descending on prisoners. At the same time, the laws changed. And there were tough on crime sentencing laws in Texas that made a prisoner's sentence longer. This was happening everywhere. It's happening in California. It's happening in New York. It's happening across the American South. And the federal government, through the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, is also parceling out large pots of money to individual states to build prisons, to engage in policing. But what I found in Texas was that these prisoner rights suits, on the one hand, won their claim. They won the day. It's quite an amazing story, a testament of collective truth-telling, that they could collectively do this as racially segregated prisoners who engaged in an interracial movement where black and brown prisoners alike imagined themselves as slaves, made that claim, had a system-wide work strike in 1978 at the very moment the case goes to trial. And yet, at the same time that they did all of this, the system responded with what I call carceral massive resistance. They thumbed their nose at the court. They said, well, the court may have passed this, but we're not going to implement it. So prisoners continued in this role of building tenders as guards, the sex trade, the violence continued. Finally, though, in 1986, the first Republican governor since Reconstruction, William P. Clements, says, all right, enough. We will end the system of building tenders. But what he says to the legislature is, because we're ending this system of building tenders, I need more money. I need more money to build prisons. And as a result, they had the largest prison construction program in the history of the world, where Texas had more prisoners during the late 1980s and 1990s than any other state, capping out at 165,000 prisoners. They, of course, are the highest in state executions, the highest in prison privatization. They have the second highest number of people in cell isolation, 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. So they built out of the ashes of the prison plantation model a new modernized system with outsourcing of violence to gangs and bringing in militarized systems of control and isolation.
Yes, and in fact, it was my experience that gangs, which I refer to as street organizations, were nurtured by the prison administration. They were given privileges and rights, and allowed to do things that no other prisoners could do. If you belonged to the gang, you could sell drugs, you could make alcohol, you could do all kinds of stuff. You could attack other prisoners. And what my experience was that the administration directly worked with the Aryan Brotherhood and the white organizations to outsource the violence, but they also worked to create the black organizations to counter organizing within the prison system among the more progressive prisoners, uh, to stymie any attempts to reform what was going on. Um, and it incorporated a lot of informers and agent provocateurs that worked with the administration. So the whole violent thing in the prison system, to me, seemed to have grown out of the administration's need to control the prison population by turning them upon each other. And for me, it reminds me of the what Eisenhower talked about when he talked about the military-industrial complex controlling the world and getting out of hand, and be aware of it. Well, the prison industrial complex seems like the domestic arm of that, and it's controlling the American population. I mean, how do you see that? Are these two things the different sides of the same coin? Controlling the world and controlling the American population with these industrial complexes?
Without a doubt, it's a fashioning of racial capitalism. And you bring up a really important point about the ways in which the prison administration consciously breaks up prisoner organizing. One, they're learning the lessons of COINTELPRO, and in fact, they're sharing them. In many of my research, I found the FBI in correspondence with prison administrators, even as the Department of Justice filed an amicus curiae brief on behalf of the prisoners. But there are two moments of this kind of separation policy. One is before the Ruiz trial, the prison administration would take politicized prisoners, and as a way to punish them, they would put them into protective custody. Now, protective custody at that time was the only wing that held prisoners who were openly gay or prisoners who were considered weak or effeminate. They did this to try and have these politicized prisoners be either subjects of rape or to be seen by the general population on their file with a quote unquote homosexual jacket as a way to demean them. What they found instead is that this exposed David Ruiz, prisoners like Ernest McMillan, who had been part of SNCC in Dallas. So many people involved in the civil rights were then put into prison. And they saw the worst horrors of the building tender system, the buying and selling of prisoner bodies, because it was in this space of protective custody where prisoners were bought and sold on the internal slave market. And that's really what I argue in this book is there was an external slavery in the fields where they're picking cotton, an internal system of slavery with the buying and selling of bodies as state reward. And they tried to put white prisoners who were politicized in with black prisoners. One white prisoner, for instance, was put with the Muslims in the hopes that they would, that racial animosity would exist. Instead, though, they protected him and they created an interracial alliance out of that. In another case, they put a white prisoner in with African American prisoners and told the head building tender to make sure that he was sexually assaulted, which he was. So sometimes it worked the other way, but more often than not, they coordinated. Now, after 1980, after they win the prisoner rights lawsuit and the building tender system begins to be disassembled and the gangs arrive, I argue it's a kind of neoliberalism with gangs. The building tender system privileged white prisoners. Only a white prisoner could be a head building tender who had total authority within the prison, second only to the warden. After that system is disrupted, that's disrupting white supremacy within the prison system. On the one hand, we think of prisons as putting everyone into the same condition and space as prisoner, white, black, Latino. That's not the case. The system reflects and even enhances and accelerates all of the racial inequalities in society. So the gangs, the Aryan Nation, started to assassinate prisoners who were politicized. And the prisoners who were politicized, one in particular named Lawrence Pope, who was a banker turned bank robber, a white prisoner and kind of the documentarian of the prisoners' rights movement in Texas. He begins to write letters that these Texas white Aryan Brotherhood are assassinating prisoners on administrative segregation, and that the prison administration, as you said, Eddie, is selling these Texas Aryan brothers right next to the prisoners who were black or brown, who were prisoner leaders. And they did it and said, well, we're doing this because you asked us to racially integrate the prison system. That was the response from the prison administration, when in point of fact, what they were doing was making those prisoners vulnerable to violence. One prisoner in particular, named Johnny Swift, who was a Black Panther and was killed by James Dumachete, a white prisoner whose cell was literally rolled open. He was a brutal murderer and known in the prison for being violent. And he was able to climb up 2 stairs of flights that were supposed to be locked and find Johnny Swift in the day room waiting for his attorney, where he killed him. So prisoners made just the claim that you're making, Eddie, that the prison administration was working with the Aryan Brotherhood, or at least allowing them free rein to engage in violence, particularly when it was targeted against the more politicized prisoners.
I am so sorry we're out of time. We could continue this discussion forever, and we'll probably have to come back and revisit it again. Robert, Dr. Chase, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Eddie. It's been my pleasure. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.